Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be joining from. I'd like to welcome you to this session on mastering Microsoft Sentinel, Elevate, and Excel in deployment. This session we'll be talking about Microsoft Sentinel planning and sizing. And to introduce myself, my name is Dave Branscome. I am a partner solutions architect focused on security. I've been at Microsoft for about 16 years and been in the security space for a number of years as well, and happy to be guiding you through this journey. So let's get right into it. What are some of the things that influence the cost of a deployment of Microsoft Sentinel? Well, as you might expect with any SIM type product, one of the biggest costs, by far the biggest cost, is typically the amount of data that you ingest. The data is going to be stored for a period of time so that you can run alerts, do detections, do threat hunting, run reporting, those types of things against the data. And so the size of the data and the length of time that that data is being stored, and even in the case of Sentinel, where it's being stored, impact the overall cost of retaining that data. So there is a cost for ingesting the data on a per gigabyte basis, and there's a cost for storing the data. So ingestion rate and storage rate are two different factors that we have to think about when we consider Microsoft Sentinel. The type of logs that you're ingesting also matter. So some of the logs, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes, that can be brought into Sentinel can be brought in at no cost because of different programs that Microsoft has available for their customers, whether you're running E3 or if you have Defender for Cloud or whatever the case might be. There are some log types that you can ingest. Remember, ingestion rate and storage rate are different. You can ingest for free. And then there are some that will always incur a cost for ingestion and storage. So if you have some Cisco appliances, or you're ingesting data from CrowdStrike, or you're ingesting data from some other third-party solution, the ingestion and storage of that data is going to incur a cost. We'll also talk about basic logs and analytics logs. And basically what this means is there's different types of logs and how they're used in the SIM workspace. And so they may have different values in terms of looking for threats. So if a log has a lower value, um, might consider making it a basic log. If it's a very good source of identifying threats, then probably it's going to be in the analytics logs. So basic logs store a smaller amount of data in terms of each log. Uh, but these tend to be very voluminous in quantity. There's a lot of these logs, but each log individually has only a little bit of information that has real value. As I mentioned, the location of the storage is important. The architecture of the storage is important, but also the Azure region where you're storing things makes a big difference. So different regions in Azure have different costs associated with them. So where you put your Sentinel storage is going to have a bearing on how much that storage overall is going to cost. And we'll walk through the pricing calculator to show you how that is true. If you're moving data between different Azure regions, or if you're moving them from another cloud, AWS, for example, you may need to consider that there may be egress and ingress costs associated with the movement of that data from one location to another. There are different billing models for Sentinel. So there's the standard pay-as-you-go model, and then there are capacity tiers. There's also a third model where we use dedicated clusters. And we'll talk about all three of these and where you might use one over the other. The features that you enable in Sentinel are going to influence the cost. Are you using Python notebooks that allow you to do structured investigations and threat hunting? They have a cost associated with them because they have a machine learning workspace on the back end that the notebook is leveraging. User and entity behavior analytics, enabling that is going to increase the amount of storage that is being used by Sentinel because you're capturing more data and using it in a little bit more complex or just you're doing more with the data. Logic apps, if you're running logic apps, they will incur a cost as well. Depending on how long you retain the data, if you're keeping it more than 90 days in log analytics, that's going to be a billable expense. And then what your long-term storage options are, whether you're storing it long-term in log analytics, if you move the data to an archive log, if you move it to an Azure Data Lake service, if the data comes into a basic log, there's a retention time period there. But if you want to move that basic log into some other storage architecture, then there's going to be a cost associated with it. So as you can see, there's a lot of different things that impact Sentinel cost. And so there's a lot of decisions that have to be made. And this doesn't even factor in um, the, uh, the, the decisions that you might need to make about what data sources you're pulling from. So obviously you want to pull from things like Active Directory or Microsoft Entra and Microsoft 365 and Azure. But what other things make a difference? So which servers have value um, and what type of logs are valuable to you? Are you pulling in from Linux environment and you have to do syslog forwarding, or do you have to do transforms and a variety of other things can actually increase the complexity of a Sentinel environment, as well as influencing the cost of the overall management. As I mentioned, there are a couple different elements to the pricing model. We're looking at just two of them right here, and those are the pay-as-you-go model as well as the capacity tiers. So with pay-as-you-go, this is more or less the default model when you spin up an Azure environment. And this just means that whatever data you ingest, that's what you're paying for. And you can ingest a little bit or a lot, and the price is going to be the same. Now you're going to for the pay-as-you-go, it is going to be at a higher rate than the capacity tiers, because what happens is if you're ingesting it in a capacity tier, you're saying I commit to um, a 100 gig or 200 gig of data will be ingested into my Sentinel environment. And because you're committing that much storage to your environment, we do give you a discount on the amount of money you pay for that storage. So depending on how high your capacity tier goes, you can get up to 60% savings as compared to the pay-as-you-go option. With capacity tiers, you're not locked into a specific capacity tier. You can change that whenever you need to. So every 30 day or every 31 days, you're able to change capacity tiers, and you can downgrade them if you need to. So it is a very flexible pricing model and allows you to look at what you're ingesting and make some budget decisions around that. So I did mention that there are some programs that Microsoft has that will allow you to reduce the cost of your Sentinel environment. And one of the first ones that a customer should take advantage of is the free trial. So if a customer is not sure, for example, how much data they're going to be ingesting on a regular basis, this is a good way to start out and kind of gauge what that will actually look like. I mean, we have pricing calculators, which we'll walk through in a minute, but um, uh, it may be good to actually bring data in so that it's maybe a more accurate representation of what the live environment is going to contribute to the overall storage cost. So with the free trial, you can ingest up to 10 gig a day for the first 31 days at no cost, or you can add Sentinel to an existing log analytics workspace for free for the first 31 days. So this gives you some flexibility and allows you to use that first 31 days as a way of maybe gauging what the cost of ingesting data into Sentinel will be. The second scenario that a customer can take advantage of is if they are on the licensing plan that ends in a 5, so E5, A5, F5, and G5. If they are using that licensing plan, what they can use is, or what they can do is, for each of the users that has that licensing SKU, that user can ingest 5 meg per day of free data into Microsoft Sentinel. So if you have 100 users, then you have 500 meg overall, broken down by 5 meg per user per day, that can be brought into Microsoft Sentinel. So that's a nice cost savings, and this happens automatically when a user is provisioned with an E5 license. That the ingestion of that data, the application of that free level of data, that happens automatically. So they don't need to do anything to enroll in this program. They don't need to be nominated for the program or anything like that. Just the fact that they're on that licensing plan will automatically start providing them with that discount. So what are the types of data that we're talking about that get ingested at this discounted rate? Things like your sign-in and audit logs, any shadow IT discovery logs, purview information protection logging, and then any M365 advanced hunting data that can all contribute to the amount of data that each user is contributing to the overall Sentinel storage. A third scenario that customers and these are all additive, right? It's not that you have to pick one or the other. All of these can be taken advantage of. But this is one that I like to point out to customers because many don't know about this. Some partners are not even aware of it. But the basic idea here is that Microsoft Sentinel and Microsoft Defender for Cloud both use on the back end for storage a log analytics workspace. So since they're both using the log analytics workspace, what you can do is actually configure them so that Sentinel and Defender are using the same log analytics workspace. So point them both to the same log analytics workspace. And when you do that, if the customer is also using Microsoft Defender for Servers Plan 2 in their Defender for Cloud environment, then the servers that are in that plan may ingest 500 meg free per day per server of security data. So each server that has Microsoft Defender for Servers Plan 2 licensing associated with it that is running in Defender for Cloud, or that's managed by Defender for Cloud, I should say, can bring in 500 meg of free data. The data types that we're talking about are these. And so these are the typical security type logging that would be very valuable for threat hunting and detections and so on. Now remember that saying that the server is protected by Defender for Cloud or that they're using Defender for Cloud does not require that the server that has this licensing applied to it the server does not have to be in the cloud. Remember, you can manage servers in Defender for Cloud, in Azure, in AWS, in GCP, but also on premises. So you can apply the licensing of Defender for Servers Plan 2 through Defender for Cloud to your on-premises servers. And if you do that, then this licensing benefit applies to you as well. So you can cover both on-premises and cloud-based servers with this benefit, and that can be a significant amount of data that is ingested into your Sentinel workspace, and that's useful for threat hunting on a daily basis. The last program that customers can take advantage of, and this is always free, your Azure activity logs, your Office 365 audit logs, which are going to cover your SharePoint activity, Exchange, and Teams, and then the alerts from the Microsoft Defender suite of products, all the alerts that come from these different uh, solutions is a free data source. So there's a number of different programs that can help customers reduce the amount of spend in Sentinel for their storage, and it's good to take advantage of those. Now, I mentioned a couple different things early on. I mentioned that there is this concept of pay-as-you-go, and there is the concept of commitment tiers or capacity tiers, depending on how you read it. It's the same thing either way, whether you call it capacity or commitment tiers. But basically, the pay-as-you-go, as I mentioned earlier, is generally going to result in a more expensive um, monthly cost. So the ingestion and storage for data that's coming into Sentinel using the pay-as-you-go model is going to be $4.30 per gig. So this is using the pay-as-you-go model. If you move over to a commitment tier, again, where you're saying that you commit to 100 gig per day, um, uh, that enables you to take advantage of a discount. So at 100 gig per day, you would be paying $296, which works out to $2.96 per gig per day. So $2.96 versus $4.36 or $4.30 is a pretty significant discount, and it only gets better as we go on down the line here. So commitment tiers, if a customer has a large amount of ingestion that they're going to be uh, that they're anticipating in Sentinel, this is definitely the way to go. On the other hand, if a customer doesn't have any idea how much data they'll actually be ingesting, this might be the way to go initially until they get a good gauge of how much data they're bringing in, and if they qualify for one of these commitment tiers, then then they should move over to that. As I mentioned before, with the commitment tiers or capacity tiers, you have the ability to opt out of the tier at any time after the first 31 days of commitment. Over here are a few other costs, some of them that we mentioned, and one in particular that was not listed on the other slide, and that is Microsoft Sentinel solution for SAP. So we can do detection, threat detection, and alerting against your SAP system. So this can often be a juicy target for attackers, your SAP system, because it has some very interesting data and data that attackers would like to get their hands on. So you want to protect that and do the alerting on that. There is a cost associated with this solution for SAP, however. So if we take a look overall at the different architectures that come into play with our Sentinel storage, this is sort of how it plays out at a high level. Initially, when data comes into Sentinel, it's going to go into our log analytics workspace, their analytics logs. This is the area that has full KQL capabilities. In other words, all the KQL operators will work against data that's in your log analytics workspace. You can run detections and alerts. There are no limits to how many queries you run against the log analytics workspace, and 90 days are included in your default Sentinel instance. Um, the ingestion charge in log analytics, and if you kind of look at this, kind of makes sense from the pay-as-you-go perspective, what we're doing here. $2.30 for log analytics storage, and then $2 for the Microsoft Sentinel ingestion charge. That 2.3 plus 2 works out to the $4.30 that we see here, right? So all that we're showing here is how that number gets broken down. This can also be numbers that are listed for, like the capacity tiers. So after 90 days, your data can, you have to figure out what you're going to do with your data. Your log analytics workspace allows you to store data for up to 2 years. But there is a cost associated with storing it here, and this is the most expensive way to store data long term. So what are some of the options that are available? Well, let's first take a look at the basic logs. Now, you remember we talked about the basic logs having perhaps a lesser value in terms of threat hunting and alerting. Now, because of this, because they have lesser value, they have fewer KQL operators available to them. So while over here, any KQL query can be issued because all the KQL operators are supported, on the basic logs, there are a reduced number of KQL operators, and these are documented on learn.microsoft.com. You cannot run alerts against basic logs. You have limitations on how many concurrent queries can be run. And probably the most significant one is that basic logs are only retained by default for 8 days. Now, why would you use basic logs? So basic logs give you the ability to ingest logs, for example, for NSG, network security groups, or flow logs, or maybe a firewall log, things of that nature, where there's a lot of things happening just because of traffic, just network traffic is happening, DNS queries, things like that. Not all of them are useful from a threat hunting perspective, and they generate a lot of data. There's just a huge number of logs that are generated by basic logs. And so they have less value from a threat hunting perspective, but there's a lot of them. So because of this, the total amount from an ingestion and storage perspective is $1 per gig, because you're only storing it, first of all, for 8 days, but also because we would anticipate that if you're going to keep these long term, you're going to move them off into less expensive storage. When you run a query, even though the queries have a reduced number of operators available and a reduced number of concurrent queries, when you run those queries, there is a charge of $0.005 for every gigabyte scanned. So those are two of the core types of logging or logging architectures that you might want to consider. Now, how do we handle longer term retention? So you can store both basic logs or log analytics logs into what we call a data archive. And in the data archive, this supports batch queries with a limited number of KQL operators that can be run against the data archive. You can store the data for a much longer time. So you can store up to 7 years maximum in the data archive area. Um, and the storage within data archive is 2 cents per gig per month. So that's dramatically less expensive even than basic logs, and significantly less expensive than what we get in the analytics workspace. But because there are some limitations to what you can do against the data archive, there may be times where you need to pull data out of the archive and bring it back into a location where you can actually act on it in a more detailed way. So how do we do that? We can restore data out of the archive back into our log analytics workspace. And when we do that, there's a restore charge of 10 cents per gig per day. There's a minimum daily charge for 2 terabytes and 12 hours, which works out to about $96, and it's prorated hourly. So, um, uh, bringing data back into the log analytics workspace will have um, a cost associated with it. Now, that doesn't mean that you always have to restore data into log analytics in order to run a query. As it mentions here, you can batch queries with limited KQL operators. And in order to do that, you can run the queries just directly against your data archive. But if you want to do what we call search jobs, you do have to re-ingest the data into your log analytics workspace, and the cost for querying against that the re-ingested data is 0.005 gig percent or dollars per gig that is being scanned. So this might be something where, let's say, data has been archived for a year, and the limited KQL operators that you have um, aren't going to be sufficient to do the search that whatever task you're doing is going to require. So let's say something has happened, and then over a period of time, the logging data that captured that occurrence, maybe that there's an insider risk type of activity. So that happens. The logs eventually get pushed into data archive, and later on, a year later, somebody notices this insider risk type of activity. In order to do a more comprehensive query and search against the data where this was captured, um, you may need to restore that data into the log analytics workspace and then run a comprehensive search job against the restored data. Um, and so we do this, we make this option available so that these search jobs have a longer running time than a standard KQL query. So a standard KQL query will time out after a certain number of hours if it's just been running forever and hasn't been able to complete. These search jobs, however, are able to scan much larger amounts of data and run for a much longer period of time for these types of investigations where you're just looking through hundreds and hundreds of gigs of data. They run a little bit slower, perhaps, but they can also run for a much longer period of time than your standard KQL is able to. So long term, what are the options that are available? As I mentioned, log analytics is not your ideal location to store data long term. It does have a lot of very good qualities for near term retention of data. So it's got good performance. The cost is high, but it does have very good usability, right? All the KQL operators are functional. You can run alerts against it. Um, and detections. So it's very good for looking at recent data and generating alerts on it. But from a long-term perspective, the cost is quite high. You can move it into Log Analytics Archive. So the longer term retention, 0 to 7 years, and the cost is less by a pretty dramatic amount. And the usability is relatively high. So you can still run queries, you can still restore data into your log analytics workspace if you need to, and so on. So there's good reasons to have data stored in your log analytics archive. From a much longer term perspective, Azure Data Explorer is by far the most popular method for storing data long term by our partners, by our customers. So the reason for this is that Azure Data Explorer allows you to ingest data um, into a much longer term storage area. So you have no limitations on how long the data can be stored. The costs are fairly manageable, and the usability is very good. So, um, and the performance it can be very good, but depending on what you're trying to do, it could be relatively low. But what's nice about this is that it allows you to do things like extended threat hunting, compliance type work, trend analysis, storage of non-security data, auditing. So it's a very functional way of storing data. And essentially the costs that are associated with it have to do with moving the data out of log analytics and into Data Explorer. So there's a logic app that performs this operation for you, and um, uh, that has to be charged. I'm sorry, it's an event hub that does that, not a logic app. And then there's Azure Blob Storage. So Azure Blob Storage is kind of where you'd store data long term. If you don't really want to do a whole lot with it, you just have to keep the data from an archive perspective. Maybe some kind of regulatory requirement dictates that you have to keep it for 20 years or something like that. That might be a good reason to move stuff into Azure Blob Storage. Now, calculating the amount of money it's going to cost to manage your Sentinel environment or deploy your Sentinel environment can be a little bit of science, a little bit of magic. Um, and there's a couple different ways that you can use our tools to determine what that cost will be. There's the online pricing calculator that is available on the Azure website, and there's an Excel pricing calculator that you can download from the partner um, tooling. So with the online pricing calculator, the thing that I like about it is that you aren't limited to just Sentinel pricing. If you're working with a customer and they have a lot of Sentinel or a lot of Azure work that they want to do, and Sentinel happens to be one of them, the online pricing calculator allows you to put all those things in the same set of calculations and present a single pricing spreadsheet or pricing outline to the customer without having to do separate ones for Sentinel and then your other tools. The pricing is always current. It does support scenarios where you have to deploy, for example, Sentinel or other Azure services in multiple regions. As I mentioned, the different regions have different pricing models, and so if you need to deploy Sentinel in the Americas, and then you also have to deploy Sentinel in the UK, that can be done and represented properly in the pricing calculator. Whereas if you're doing that with the Excel pricing calculator, you'd have to create multiple instances of the Excel spreadsheet to do that. It stores the data online under your login ID. So when you build the pricing spreadsheet or the pricing calculations with the online pricing calculator, You can go back and look at that saved information, adjust it if you need to, and and it just gets stored online, which is very handy. And you can export it with part numbers, so it makes it easier for pricing. So my preference is, if you have the ability, run the online pricing calculator as your final decision making tool. If all you're trying to do is give a customer an estimate of what Sentinel is going to cost, a kind of a ballpark estimate, I would use the Excel pricing calculator because it's very easy to use, and it takes very little time to actually get you to the point of um, of having a number available for them. So if you're using the online pricing calculator, one of the things you need to do is figure out the region where Sentinel is going to be set up. Um, the the temptation might be to install Sentinel in the cheapest region you can possibly find. And while there's advantages to that, realistically, what we want to do is try as much as possible to locate Sentinel closest to the resources that will be sending logs to Sentinel. So a couple reasons for that. Um, Number one, it makes things a little less complex, so that you're not sending data between different regions, but it also can help you avoid some of these ingress egress pricing charges between Azure regions that may apply. So if you went kind of crazy with it and decided that you're going to put Sentinel in, I don't know, Australia, and all your resources are located in the United States, um, uh, you may be saving money on the actual storage, but you kind of lose that price savings because of the network ingress egress pricing uh, between the two regions. The other thing, obviously, that you have to factor in is, what are the compliance regulations that apply? So, in the crazy scenario that I just gave, maybe you're subject to United States laws, and moving things to an Azure data center that's in Australia um, may not allow you to meet those compliance laws because the data center itself, being located in Australia, is subject to different types of laws. Anyway, just give consideration to the region where Sentinel is going to be set up. Figure out the pricing model that you're going to use. We've talked about pay-as-you-go and commitment tiers. One that we didn't talk about is dedicated clusters. So if a customer has a very large environment where they're ingesting a lot of Sentinel data and perhaps are also using log analytics workspaces for Azure Monitor. So keep in mind the different use cases here. Sentinel is used as a way of tracking and alerting on security focused data. So event logs and audit logs and things like that. You can also use log analytics workspaces for Azure Monitor. And Azure Monitor has a little different use case. Azure Monitor is, you might think of it as an operational tool. So it's mostly being used to track things like the performance of a server or an application or a Kubernetes cluster or whatever. So is it being overused? Is it being underused? Are there alerts when an application fails? Are there alerts when there's extremely high usage of an application? Those aren't necessarily security events. And so they would logically fall into the Azure Monitor category. However, because they're still using log analytics workspaces, what we can do is create this architecture called the dedicated cluster. So if the customer is ingesting more than 500 gig a day, you can cluster these workspaces. And what that will allow you to do is optimize the cost across those workspaces. So it allows you to apply cost savings across multiple workspaces, including those that are related to performance and not just to Sentinel security data. So different ways that we can um, even further reduce the overall cost of our Azure environment. Remember that the online and downloadable calculators are by default displaying capacity tier pricing based on the amount of data that you define in your calculations. That does not necessarily reflect the discounts that a customer may be able to benefit from due to an EA agreement that they have with Microsoft or a MAC agreement that they have with Microsoft. So a MAC agreement is basically that a customer buys in advance a set or a dollar amount for Azure consumed charges, right? So they're saying, I commit to spending $1,000 this year with Microsoft Azure, and they can apply that to different workloads, including Sentinel. So that MAC agreement may help them to reduce the amount of money that they spend on Sentinel, and that isn't reflected in the pricing calculators. This is a little bit more detail or just a more specific type of detail around the use of analytics logs or your basic logs. And so, we've talked about this quite a bit already, but sometimes it's necessary to kind of have it written out. You want to make sure that you're planning properly for the retention of your data in your analytics workspace. What do you do with the data when it reaches that 90 days and you need to move the data somewhere? Either get rid of it or move it into a longer term retention area. Where is that longer term retention area? And what's the process for getting it over there? Your basic logs, again, are logs that maybe have a lower value from a security and threat hunting perspective, but that may have value overall. So again, if you think about it, if you look at your firewall logs have some security data for sure, right? If someone is trying to break into your environment or is pounding against a firewall, trying to get in, that's interesting from a security perspective. But there's also a lot of traffic that goes in and out of a firewall that is just normal traffic. People trying to access the internet, people, sending email, or if you have an on-premises email server, connections to VPN from external sources and things like that. So all those things may go through a firewall, and they're logged, and those logs add up to a large number of logs, but they don't all have security value like, as an example, your security logs on a server would. So um, you may want to have those logs, you may want to have those firewall logs, um, but you don't need to keep them long term necessarily, because you're probably not going to be looking through firewall logs a year from now. One thing to keep in mind here is that there is no ability within the Excel spreadsheet to do basic log calculations. However, that is possible on the online pricing calculator. With your long-term data usage, if you choose to use Azure Data Explorer, again, it's got an indefinite retention period on it. And essentially what it's doing is providing a front end, or the ability for customers to move data from their Sentinel log analytics workspace through an event hub and move it into lower cost Azure Blob storage. So there is the cost for the actual storage itself, but there is also a cost associated with the export of the data and then the charge by throughput unit through the Event Hub, and then moving that data over into the Azure Blob Storage. Similarly to basic logs, your Excel spreadsheet doesn't have a uh, uh, the capability of doing ADX sizing in the Excel spreadsheet. So let's take a look at these things, and you can kind of visualize what it is I've been talking about here. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, go over to my window over here, and let's take a look at what we're doing. So we're looking here at my Sentinel instance, and what I'm going to do is show you where some of the artifacts that we've been talking about are located. So how do we determine what pricing model we're on and how we can change that? So if I go down here to settings, I click on settings. Notice here that I have information about my Sentinel pricing and my log analytics pricing. I see how much data I'm ingesting over the last 31 days. In this case, I have the ability to change a log analytics tier. And so as you can see, I'm on the old pricing experience where these two things were separated out. Now we have what's called the simplified pricing experience that allows us to combine the cost of both these things into a single pricing model. And to do that, I can just click on this and it will switch me over to the new pricing. But when I do that, and I will, I just want to show this to you. I'll have just a single location where I can change these capacity and commitment tiers depending on what the volume is that I anticipate. I go to my settings. This is where I can turn on my UEBA, my workspace configuration manager, auditing and health reporting, and so on, and then my workspace settings. So this is where some of the more important types of cost management strategies can be implemented. If I go on the left-hand side here to usage and estimated cost. So I'm in settings, usage and estimated costs. And here I see that I'm on the pay-as-you-go model right now. So I'm paying per gigabyte. And I can see the pricing that's being applied to me. $2.30 for data ingestion. Basic log ingestion is 50 cents. This doesn't count my storage, remember. And then I have my commitment tiers here that I'm able to take advantage of. And it shows me what my usage is. So in this case, I have a fairly low amount of usage, so there's no value in me going to the 100 gig per day commitment tier because I'm going to pay that amount, whatever it is, the $296, because I'm committing to using a certain amount, or I'm anticipating that I'll use at least this amount. So it doesn't make sense for me to commit to that. I should stay on the pay-as-you-go tier. Now, a couple things that are interesting to me are up here along the top. I have a daily cap and a data retention model or button. So I click on the daily cap. What the daily cap allows me to do, if I turn this on, is say, I'm not going to ingest any more than, in this case, 5 gig per day into my Sentinel workspace. This is probably not something that you would necessarily want to cap because from a security perspective, you don't want to stop receiving security data. Now, I've put a number on here just because this is not a live production environment and I've got a limitation on how much I'm allowed to spend. So I'm saying, I don't want to spend more than 5 gig per day so that I don't hit my my quota on what I'm allowed to spend. So again, from a security perspective, I'm not sure I would do this, but maybe from a if you're doing Azure Monitor, because again, this is just a log analytics workspace that we're looking at, so it has the same structure whether the application that's sitting on top of it is Sentinel or Azure Monitor. From an Azure Monitor perspective, I might put a cap on this so that if an application kind of goes off the rails and just generates a ton of data, that it doesn't just create an enormous amount of spend on repetitive type of alerting. So that's your daily cap. Data retention, this is where you define how long you want to keep data in your log analytics workspace. So I'm using the 31-day retention that's included in my pricing plan, which is the pay-as-you-go tier. But I can also increase that by default. Not by default, but we recommend that you go to at least 90 days if you're deploying Sentinel, just because that's a good number of days that you can hunt for attackers. 30 days might be just a little bit too short. Now, one thing that you might notice here is that you can set data retention and data archive limitations on a per table basis. So this data retention number that I'm defining here is for the log analytics workspace as a whole. Now, within each log analytics workspace, there are a number of tables. So the log analytics workspace has all these different tables that make up the overall workspace. So in theory, I can go in here, and I'm not sure if this specific one will allow me to do it, but I can go in and I can change the length of time that I'm going to save this specific table, even though the overall workspace says that the stuff is going to be stored only for 31 days. So this specific table is now set to be retained for 120 days, whereas the rest of the workspace is being stored for 31. So I'm going to kick that back to the defaults. So that's kind of interesting to keep in mind as an option. If there are some things that you want to keep in your log analytics workspace, where it's queryable and you can set a workspace alert rules and stuff like that. You can do that on a table by table basis if that's a value to you. Now we talked about the pricing calculator, so I'm going to show you that now. So the pricing calculator is azure.microsoft.com, your language, and then pricing/calculator. So the first thing that you want to do is log in with some Microsoft account. So I'm going to do that here. And as you can see, I'm logged in with my Microsoft account. But this could just easily be a Outlook.com or MSN or Live or whatever type of account. So the way that this basically works is that you choose the products that you want to include in the pricing calculation, and then you define the parameters around those individual elements. So I'm going to go look at my saved estimate, and we can take a look at this one first. So I've defined this one as Alpine Ski House. I've added Microsoft Sentinel here. As you can see, I've defined the region where I'm going to locate this. I can define what the ingestion type is that I'm going to be basing my pricing on. In this case, I'm saying what is the size of the data, the number of gigabytes that I'm going to be ingesting on a daily basis. Here I'm saying I'm going to be ingesting just about a terabyte of data per day. I could also do this in events per second. So if I have good information about how many events per second are being generated in my environment, so for example, if you already have an existing SIM that tracks very specifically, very accurately, how many events per second are flowing into that sim. You can use that calculation, um, but you do have to know the numbers here, right? You have to know how many events per second are being generated and what is the average size of each of those events. So there's a way that you can do this in the online or the downloadable pricing calculator. But for now, let's just go with daily logs. This is the model that most customers are going to use. So you define the number of gigabytes per day for your analytics logs, and let's go. Let's do 20 gig per day. And then for our basic logs, we'll do 80. So we've got a lot of firewall activity. We've got a lot of network flow logs and that type of thing. So that's going to generate more data going into basic logs than into our analytics logs. So now it's using our pay-as-you-go pricing of $4.30 per day. I've got my 20 gig per day, 30 days, got my 80 gig per day of basic logs at $1 per gig, and I get my total pricing over here that ends up being $4,908 a month. Now, what I haven't done yet is define how long I'm going to retain data beyond this default 30 days. So because it's Sentinel, um, remember that the first 3 months are free for retaining data in your analytics uh, or your log analytics workspace. So if we assume that I'm ingesting 608 gig of data per month and I store it for 90 days or 3 months at 10 cents per gig, there's no cost because I've got 3 months and the first 3 months are free. Now, if I start moving this up and I say 4 months, you'll notice over here that there will start to be a cost, right? So let's keep it at 3. And then once we go beyond that, where do we start moving the data? Do we move it to a data archive? So in the data archive, let's say I want to keep that for, let's say 60 months. So 60 months ends up at what is that, 5 years. So remember, I've got a 7-year possibility here for my data archive. I'm just going to say 5 years. So 3,000 gig per month for 60 months at 2 cents a gig is 36.50 per month. Okay. Remember, I talked about data restore. So let's say we've got 3,000 gig going into data archive every month, and at some point I'm anticipating that I'll probably need to restore some of that data and run queries against it. So let's just say by default that I'm going to restore, let's say 3 terabytes, and I'm going to keep it for 10 days. So I'm restoring 3 terabytes. I'm going to my log analytics workspace, and I'm going to keep it in that log analytics workspace for 10 days so that I can run some queries and search jobs against it. So that's going to, and this is just an anticipation, right? It's not that I automatically get charged this. This is just I'm figuring that of this archive data, at some point I'm going to need to do a restore. That restore might be on this general size level, and that I'll probably need to keep it for this long. If I'm just going to be doing some log querying, let's say I'll be doing, let's just say 10 queries, and the amount of data that I'm going to scan is 50 gig. So we're talking about querying, running these queries or search jobs against the restored data. So this is I'm doing some kind of long-term searching, and because I'm doing this, there is a cost associated with it, but you can see it's not overly expensive. It's only going to run me $2.50. my search jobs. So how many of these search jobs am I going to do? Let's say I'm going to do 2, and maybe I'll query, let's call it 250 gig. And again, a fairly small cost for the actual queries that we're running. It's the restore cost that ends up costing quite a bit of money, and the retention for it. So let's say I'm going to keep it for 13 days. It increases it on that side too. So overall, my anticipated monthly cost for this instance of Sentinel, based in the East region, right, the East US region, for those parameters is going to be $12,535. And this is just a ballpark number that we're looking at. I can also deploy a second instance of Sentinel, and this time I'm going to put it in the UK. So I'm a multinational. And in this case, I'm going to say my analytics logs, I'm going to do 152, and my basic logs, 100 gig, we'll leave it at that. And so I get my pricing here. What's my retention? I'll leave it the 3 months there, and I'll keep my 60 months, 5 years of data archive. My data restore, let's keep this for 7 days. My search and query jobs, let's say we do 4 queries, and we'll be looking at an average of 75 gig. My search jobs will be, we'll do 6 of those, and we'll be doing 150 gig. So in this case, we're looking at $34,000 for the data center in UK. Now, I've also got the ability to configure Data Explorer. So Data Explorer, again, I can run this in whatever region. In this case, I'm going to say East US. I can define whether it's a production or dev test environment. And then I have to make some other calculations about the amount of data that's going to be pulled from my log analytics workspace. How much of it is what we call hot cache retention, what's the total retention, and then the data compression. What are the engines that I'm going to be using for my event hub and so on, and how long is it going to be running? So I have some parameters around those instances, and that was chosen for me here by auto selecting those engine instances. But if I turn that off, I can go in and manually choose them. But I'm going to let it tries to choose the most optimal selection for you. The data management instances, it picks this for me. I can change this to reserve instances and save some money if I want to. Storage and transactions, again, is sort of auto-filled. The networking elements and Data Explorer markup. So on a monthly basis, I'm incurring $648 to move the data over into an Azure Blob storage using Azure Data Explorer. So overall, what this has allowed me to do is create a multi-region deployment of Sentinel with Azure Data Explorer. I've got, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this one. It's allowed me to configure a retention or archival area and plan for restoring that data if needed. And then I can define to a limited amount any types of unique agreements that may exist between the customer and Microsoft. Now, a couple things that are interesting down here as well are the ability to show part numbers. Now, if you look over here at the dollar sign, when I click this display part numbers, it's going to adjust so that we see part numbers for each component of the overall cost. So I know what I need to order in order to, or that I need to price out with Microsoft in order to get the pricing that I'm looking for. I can export this to an Excel spreadsheet. I can save it. And if I save it, remember, in this case, because I'm working from an existing spreadsheet, let's say that because we're now in 2024, I want to save this as Alpine Ski House 2024. And I'm going to say revised because they've changed their model of what they want to do. And what it's going to do is give me another tab in this area that I can go look at. Let's pop out of it and then go back to saved estimates. Open it. And you can see down here, it's given me the old estimate as well as the new estimate. So there's my older one. I have to actually change the title here, but this is my new 2024 revised estimate. Okay. And let's go ahead and save that. So that's the online pricing calculator. Very functional for what we need to do. And again, I would opt to use this over the Excel spreadsheet just because it gives me a whole lot more flexibility than the Excel spreadsheet. But again, if it's just a quick and dirty type of estimate that you want to provide to a customer, then maybe just the Sentinel spreadsheet is valuable for you. Let's wrap things up here with our summary. So there are a bunch of documents that you can take a look at that show you the different components that I've talked about, how each of them work, the different benefits that you can take advantage of, the commitment tiers, what it means to do ingestion time transformations. I kind of alluded to that a little bit earlier. There are some playbooks or visualizations that you can use to see where your costs are increasing, or there might be problems with the data that you're ingesting, things like that. So these are all good things to have in your back pocket and in your customer environment to make sure that they're making the best use of their Azure spend. So that brings us to the end of this session. I appreciate your time and attention. I hope it's been valuable for you. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to your partner representatives, and they can get you in touch with someone like me or someone on our team that can help you with your Sentinel sizing estimates. So thank you. Everybody have a nice day, and we'll talk to you again soon.